Okay, greetings everyone. We will go ahead and get started with tonight's Venezuela Solidarity Network monthly online webinar, today co-sponsored also with the Americas Without Sanctions campaign. Before I go any further, I want to let everyone know that tonight's program is being simultaneously translated. Some of our speakers will be speaking in English and some will be speaking in Spanish. This means that if you want to participate in English today, go down to the bottom of your screen. It might be under the more, or it might be just the globe symbol at the bottom, and click to join the English discussion. If you can speak both languages, you can stay right where you are. I'm going to put also some instructions up here in a second to join the interpretation. And if you want to participate in Spanish, I will explain that in 1 second. Here we are.
Okay, so to activate simultaneous interpretation, look for the globe icon that is on the bottom part of your Zoom screen and select the language of your choice. If you are using a cell phone, remember that you need to click on the 3 dots that say more in order to find the option for interpretation. It's a good idea to choose the mute original audio selection, to choose that because your audio will be, the audio that you get will be clearer. Thank you. The instructions are there for a couple of more seconds. Welcome to all of you.
Okay, so as I was saying, tonight is the monthly webinar of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. Tonight, the topic is discussing Venezuela versus the Alien Enemies Act. My name is Allison Bodine, and I am joining here from Vancouver, Canada, the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I am coordinator of Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, author of the book Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Venezuela from Battle of Ideas Press, and also a founding member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. On Sunday, March 16th, US President Trump brutally deported more than 200 Venezuelan migrants, actually 238 Venezuelan migrants to be exact, to prisons in El Salvador. To do so, he invoked the Alien Enemies Act against alleged members of the Tren de Aragua criminal organization. This was an outrageous and illegal action against the basic humanity of Venezuelan migrants who face dangerous conditions and an uncertain future in Salvadoran prisons. So today, the Venezuela Solidarity Network wanted to respond quickly to this increasing attack against Venezuelan migrants, also within the context, of course, of Trump's continued attacks and increasing attacks on all migrants and of Trump's war against Venezuela. So we brought together 4 excellent speakers on these topics to speak about the impact of the hundreds, actually thousands, of unilateral coercive measures known as sanctions and the root cause of Venezuelan migration, as well as speak from the perspective of as someone in El Salvador, where the Venezuelans have been deported to, as well as activists and organizers in the United States working for migrant rights. The Venezuela Solidarity Network, I'll just say briefly, is a new North America-based network of organizations and individuals working to defend Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination against US government-led sanctions and attacks. Our website is www.venezuelasolidarity.org, a website you visited probably to register for today's webinar, but we encourage you to check out the other sections as well. Sponsoring organizations of the VSN include the Alberto Llovera Bolivarian Circle of New York City, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, the Alliance for Global Justice, Chicago Alba Solidarity, Code Pink, Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice Canada, Friends of the Congo, the International Action Center, Just Peace Advocates, the Louis Riel Bolivarian Circle of Toronto, the Orinoco Tribune, Peace Action Wisconsin, Popular Resistance, the Revolutionary Communist Group and Rock Around the Blockade in Britain, Sanctions Kill Campaign, the Solidarity Committee on the Americas in Minnesota, Task Force on the Americas, Venezuela Analysis, and Workers' World Party. And we are always welcoming new people to join us to help organize not only these webinars, but hopefully continuing ongoing open letters, writing informational pieces to be submitted to newspapers, working on street actions in solidarity with Venezuela. There's so much important work we need to do in solidarity with a country and a people that are under the boot of the United States, facing sanctions, facing attacks on Venezuelan migrants, and really standing up against US imperialism. So as I said, for today's webinar, we have a panel of 4 excellent speakers, followed by a question and answer period. And we'll take questions when the panel is over, but you can use the Q&A chat in the bottom of your screen or post in the chat if you have questions as people are speaking. We just don't want to miss anything. So if you really want your question answered, please put it in the Q&A. Also, just a big thank you in advance to Mercedes and Julieta, who are simultaneously interpreting tonight's webinar and making it possible for us to organize bilingual events. Without further ado, I want to introduce Lucrecia Hernandez. She is a lawyer and a graduate from the University of Buenos Aires with a master's degree in human rights, criminal and procedural law from the University of Barcelona, Spain, and with the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, CLASCO. She's been a consultant for the United Nations organizations UNICEF and the United Nations Development Program, as well as Vice Chancellor of the National Experimental Security University. She is currently director of the Venezuelan human rights organization, SURES, who I've had the pleasure of meeting with in trips, as many people have, and learning from when we're in Venezuela together. So Lucrecia, you have the responsibility to open today's panel, and we really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Okay, Alison, thank you very much. Thank you to you. And I'd like to say hi and greet all of my comrades from the panel. Many of them are comrades of the struggle and of life. And I'd like to thank you especially, Alison, for all the support, for all the solidarity with the Venezuelan people, who has been unconditional from the moment that we've met. And you have joined the struggle and the international campaign for Venezuela. You have given me indeed a great responsibility for opening this panel, particularly because I only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to condense the issue of Venezuelan migration or immigration that is related directly to the situation that the Venezuelan people is living of economical, financial, and commercial or trade blockade by the United States and its allies. And I believe that this is a very important point, and this is a very important starting point to understand the issue of Venezuelan migration. Since 2014, in a formal way, the economic blockade begins, the financial and trade blockade against Venezuela begins by the US government. And as of that moment, there is a scaling of unilateral coercive measures, as this is called by the United Nations. And these measures have increased, and they have cornered Venezuelan economy in order to generate change very abruptly in the government, in the Venezuelan government. There has been an attempt, but there has been a worsening of quality of life conditions because of the financial choking that the U.S. government has been imposing on Venezuela when it blocks, or in its blocking, the sale of oil and also products for the Venezuelan oil industry. This has generated, of course, this has caused a very complex economic situation. We must remember that Venezuela's main source of income of foreign currency and the money devoted to social programs comes through the sale of oil. 95% of foreign currency that the state requires for social programs and policies come from the sale of oil. And the US government has blocked through different executive orders the selling of oil, the selling of gold, cryptocurrency, Venezuelan cryptocurrency, and this has complicated the economic situation of Venezuela. So, while this financial blockade becomes more acute, particularly during the first presidency of Donald Trump, this will generate or this will create or has created a process of Venezuelan migration of people who are seeking to improve their life conditions towards the country, other countries in the region. We must understand that Venezuela, up until 2017, from the point of view of United Nations, was a country that was a receiver of migration, where all other countries in the region, particularly Colombia, because of its internal war situation, as well as other countries in the Southern Cone, because of their military dictatorships, they have gone towards Venezuela, seeking better quality of life, seeking personal safety. And Venezuela, up until 2017, Venezuela has been a receiver, receiver of migrants and not an expeller of migrants. So up until 2017, migration towards the outside, towards outside countries, did not surpass 600,000 people. But after 2017, with the increase of these coercive measures, the migrations outside of Venezuela start to double and triple, going from 600,000 in 2017 to 1,600,000 in 2018 and 2019. And from there on, even when there are difficulties in relation to counting or to accounting for migration, we see that there is a strong migration process, particularly towards other countries in the region and to a lesser degree towards countries in the north like the US and Canada. So what happens? Venezuelan migration is the result, first of all, and this is something that is very important to understand, is the result of the economic blockade against our country. But it is also important to take into account that this process of mass migration also, aside from the fact that there is a real situation of people looking for better conditions of life or better quality of life, but this was also the object of a commercialization and a politicization, and the countries in the region started to install a discourse of a narrative about Venezuela as a state, as a country where there is no rule of law or where there is no protection, and a country where there is a governmental crisis. But the truth is that we can see after several investigations is that there was also a process of propaganda of governments in the region with policies, migration policies that stimulated migration through special permits for Venezuelan people, through humanitarian measures. There has been a process where there's a there has been a process to attract Venezuelan migration. All this migration from Venezuela is very much related to the politicization and commercialization of Venezuelan migration as a very important process, as well as a process in many countries to seek for economic resources to work with migrants in their territories. In the case of the US, it was very clear how both during the first and second presidencies of Donald Trump, Venezuelan migration was a very important target in his political campaigns. both in the first campaign and in the second campaign, he promised to carry out actions to battle or to fight against irregular migration, specifically against Venezuelans.
So as of this last presidency of Donald Trump, we can see that there will be a series of measures that will affect hundreds of millions of migrants that are currently in the US territory. Migration will be addressed with very restrictive measures and very punitive measures. During his first presidency, his first term, we saw how he applied Title 42, which was applied during the pandemic. And right now, there is an act of 1978, which is the Alien Foreign Aliens Act, which will lead mass expels, which my colleague will be addressing in much more detail. She knows this firsthand, but this will lead to massively deporting people such as Venezuelans as well as other citizens, and which will also entail a massive human rights violations. People will be expelled without due guarantees only because of this act being enforced, which is very complex in terms of human rights. So as of January the 20th this year, when Trump took office, there was a review announced of the migration policies in the United States, which focused on border security and control of irregular migration. In the first 10 days since the taking of office, there were about 13 flights with people being deported. People who were living in the United States were sent to different countries in the region. In the case of Venezuela, in 2025, in February, the Migration and Customs Service reported the transfer of 177 Venezuelan migrants from Guantanamo to Honduras, where they later were sent back to Venezuela. In the past few days, as part of the new renewed act, Trump's administration decreed that this criminal gang called Tren de Aragua in Venezuela was going to be considered a criminal organization, and that people who they consider that belong to this criminal gang could be indeed deported immediately back to their home countries. But what happened? A couple of days ago, there was a 280 and 238 people were deported, and this is a show evidence of human rights violations, since these people were not respected at all, and all of them were treated as criminals. From the perspective of international human rights law, deportation to third countries is very concerning because these people do not have any link with the receiving countries. In the case of Venezuelan migrants, they were deported to El Salvador, as I said, under no sort of guarantee for their personal security nor their human rights. So all this process has been characterized by a media show-off, showing this as very harsh measures rather than humanitarian solution or giving back to the voters that trusted the new administration. This led to mass demonstrations of human rights defenders, specifically denouncing attacks and violations of human rights of Venezuelan migrants. So in order to wrap up a bit, the Venezuelan government has issued some releases and has maintained a policy to protect the human rights of the migrants. A couple of days ago, also, there was another flight with returnees back to Venezuela, and we are awaiting the resolution of such a serious scenario developing right now. This will also lead to the lack of protection for all Venezuelans who are right now, for example, under temporary protection schemes. They are facing fear and very complex situations. Many Venezuelan families have reported that they have seen people being deported, people who are in gray areas, people who were doing all the paperwork to be legally in the country. So we remain attentive to this situation as human rights defenders, and we believe that this sort of discussion spaces are increasingly important and will be useful for us to support and also denounce the situation that we are seeing right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucrecia, for giving us the context as for Venezuelan migration and also highlighting the inhumanity of the United States government, whether it is through unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela or the treatment of Venezuelan migrants. Across the board, they have shown that they do not care for 1 inch about the people of Venezuela or any migrants, but rather only care about their interests as the US government, which we'll see, I think, a repeated theme throughout all of our discussion here today, and really highlighting why it is necessary to have international solidarity and an international movement in solidarity with Venezuela's right to independence and self-determination in order to combat the media lies that are being told and the dehumanization of Venezuelan migrants, and also, the dehumanization of people in Venezuela itself by the United States government. I also wanted to just, I meant to say it in my introduction, but to say that in response to this brutal deportation of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador, people in Venezuela also mobilized. There were demonstrations in Venezuela, in support of people that have been deported to El Salvador, calling for their return home to Venezuela, and really an outpouring of love for people, even though they had chosen, we'll say, in some ways, to leave the country. And I think that was a really beautiful thing to see in photos, and perhaps we can have time to look at some of those photos later. But thank you, Lucrecia, for all of your work in really exposing the reality in Venezuela today. Next up, we are going to go to Vanessa Ramos. Vanessa is someone who was born in Puerto Rico. She's the president of the Asociación Americana de Juristas, or the American Association of Jurists, a member of the National Lawyers Guild and the Colegio de Abogados y Abogadas de Puerto Rico. And we're really honored to have Vanessa and her organization here with us today at this webinar. The floor is yours, Vanessa.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Gracias, Alison.
I'm going to speak slowly in English so the interpreters can interpret as best as possible into Spanish.
So I want to thank everyone for this invitation, and I want to follow up with what Lucrecia was giving us as a context. My context is going to be more about how this government of the United States is taking steps, and affirmative steps to advance fascism in this country. And when it's in this country, that means other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are going to be impacted. So as a general proposition, the first thing is the campaign of, before even we go into the Alien Enemies Act, the campaign of disinformation, the campaign of discrimination, and the propaganda that we have seen, okay? And this is not new, because when it comes to immigrants, the main theme has been discrimination and dehumanization against immigrants. And this go back even before the Trump administration, which means that, any immigration that is Black, Indigenous, people of color is not going to be accepted, in those centers of power. So that's the bigger context. Therefore, Venezuelan immigrants, are going to suffer this dehumanization and this discrimination. And let's add on what Lucrecia was saying about, the additional discrimination and imperialism against Venezuela when it comes to the unilateral coercive measures that are more than 950. And one more coming, which is the threat of imposing a 25% tariff on countries that, that commerce with Venezuela when it comes to, the oil resources. So that's the context. And then this humanization extends to other immigrants. This humanization is extending to Palestinians or people of Palestinian origin, is going to extend to other Latin Americans and Caribbean peoples, to Africans, or anyone that is not considered what we call the social construct of what is white. So that, that brings the context of what is the next step: to invoke laws, even if they are anachronic, all laws of the 18th century, in order to achieve those goals of dehumanizing and, and consolidating imperialism and opening the doors to fascism. And that's what I think where the Alien Enemies Act comes about. That law has only been used 3 times. One during the War of 1812 against England, the other one in World War I, and the third one in World War II. And it was mostly used against, again, here comes the racism, because, the root of all of this is racism too, against, people of Japanese descent, whether they were Japanese US citizens or not. And, that's what is used. And, at that time, when the US was in World War II, Japanese people were put into concentration camps, or they were, and these were under executive orders, or they were of the president then, Roosevelt, or they were forbidden, to leave their houses. In other words, curfew was imposed upon them. Curiously, the curfew was imposed only on Japanese, not on, not on Italians or Germans or people of those countries. And again, racism, it's, it's the context. So now it's brought back in order to dehumanize and in order to consolidate a process that is considered, not only dehumanizing, but very dangerous. What we're talking about here is that there are, whether, whether we, agree with it or not, there is a process through in the immigration system where, if you, a process for the removal of deportation of a person, you have to go through a judge, an administrative judge. You have the right, to submit, documentation. You have the right to request political asylum and other things. So all of that was, was prevented because this Alien Enemies Act, was used. So in other words, people did not have the right to due process. These people did not have any criminal charges submitted against them in the United States. So therefore, they were transported without knowledge of families. They were transported in secretive circumstances in times where there was not, these are not times of war, and these are not times of invasion. So that's, very important a thing to say. And this is something that right now is being debated in the courts. The other part of this is that in order to continue consolidating what can be a 21st century form of fascism is to continue using those old laws and to create new laws in order to, one, restrict the separation of powers, restrict freedoms such as the right to speech, the right to assembly, the right to a fair trial, the right to counsel, all of those things. And, and normalizing the illegality of what is going on right now and continue to dehumanize immigrants, because immigrants, again, and Venezuelan immigrants are going to be used as the scapegoats. All the problems of this country are what? What do they say? What does the Trump administration say? It's because immigrants are criminals, because immigrants are this or that. So it's about scapegoating because they cannot face the problems of this country. And it's about, as somebody says here, profiling people, which is unlawful and racist. Remember, when we talk about racism, this country was founded on racism. This country was founded on the enslavement of African people and on the dispossession of the indigenous people in this country, So that's part of the context. So, what's next? This crackdown is not only against the Venezuelan people, but this crackdown is extending. This is a crackdown that is extending to people that speak against, the restrictions and the censorship in this country. It's about cracking down also on legal immigrants, and we saw that recently. It's about cracking down also on tourism, and it's about cracking down on anyone that disagrees with the opinions of the Trump administration. And that will include judges also. The judge that is saying, in what the federal judge in Washington, D.C., that said, hey, wait a minute, I want that plane back. That judge has been threatened with impeachment, which is, and even this conservative judge, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roberts, said, there's a process that is called appealing here. So, you don't threaten a judge with impeachment. So there's a lot, going on in here. They're going to crack down, and they are, on people that have not only legal residence, what we call the green card, they're going to continue cracking down on people that have temporary protective status. And even, this is my opinion, they're going to go after people that naturalize as citizens because they don't like their opinions. Okay, so this is, we're living in times that sometimes I compare this to what was Germany in the early 1930s. So this is all, being is so, it's so living it day by day, this visualizing of what is coming and what it is. And, there's also one goal that the United States has, and that goal is, with respect to Venezuela, they want to what? To take the natural resources of Venezuela that belongs to the Venezuelan people. And, and that's not only in Venezuela, that's also in the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's about taking the Panama Canal. It's about taking the oil resources of Venezuela. It's about, building more military bases to control the Americas and to control our natural resources. But, I always say that, I don't know if I'm saying this in English correctly, there's always light under the tunnel. I think the streets in the United States are speaking. I have not for years seen demonstrations going on everywhere. These are, the open veins of Latin America. I would say the open veins, here of the people that live here and have always struggled, to make this country better and to, and to denounce imperialism, to denounce colonialism, to stand up against injustices and to stand for social economic justice. It's not the first time that this country has gone through this. McCarthyism was horrible. We're living in horrible times also, similar to McCarthyism. And we have to, I like always to offer some hope we have to continue doing this type of educational activity so that we get to understand the histories of each other, and we get to understand different ways of advocacy, among ourselves. I see a lot of protests in the US. I see a lot of the use of the courts in order to make points about freedom of freedom of association, freedom of speech, and other freedoms, and standing against unilateral coercive measures that are targeting Venezuela, are targeting Cuba, are targeting Nicaragua, and are targeting other countries outside of our continent. Let's not forget that this was not started by Trump. Back years ago, during the Obama administration, it was a Democrat administration under Obama that labeled Venezuela as a danger to national security. So this is an escalation of, antagonism and a blockade against Venezuela. And we have to put all of these things together, because the bottom line is the US wants, but have never achieved, trying to overthrow democratic elected governments of Venezuela since Chavez. They didn't like Hugo Chavez, and they wanted to overthrow, and they have not been able to do that. And I think that's one of the goals. They're not going to achieve it. I am very confident about that, because the people of Venezuela know what is their sovereignty, and they know what are the rights. And one other thing is that we have to watch for all of these neo-fascist governments that are taking place in Latin America. And one of them is, El Salvador, where there is estado de excepción. I don't know exactly how to translate that into English, but it's, practically, like people don't have rights. It's like a martial type of law, because, they are going to be collaborating with the United States imperial agenda. But there are other forces that are, resisting all of that. And those forces are within the United States and outside of the United States. And I want to leave you, with that thought. Another world is possible. Otro mundo es posible. Don't lose hope, and keep on fighting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Yes, important words to end on when we can feel, a lot of despair, a lot of anger, frustration, all of these things at this time, when there's attacks against Venezuelan migrants, all migrants, and all of us really as activists that have opinions different than the United States government. All of us are under threat. When one of us is under attack, all of us are under attack. So I think Adrian's going to help at the end kind of tie these different struggles together, but it's very right to say now is a moment when people in the United States, within the belly of the beast itself, are mobilized for justice, for Palestine in this case, but really speaking on behalf of all poor, working, and oppressed people under attack by the United States at this time. So thank you for bringing that perspective and that hope. I'll put in the chat as well the statement of the American Association of Jurists about the specific attack against Venezuelan migrants, and we really appreciate your time to join us here today. I want to invite up kind of where you left off was also talking about El Salvador. So I'm hoping that Fran Omar is able to join us now. Fran, if you are there and ready to go, thank you so much. Yeah. Really appreciate Fran for taking the time as well. I know you've been in the United States before and toured to speak about El Salvador. So hopefully some people that met you are online with us here today. Fran is a student activist and organizer in El Salvador with the Salvadorian social movement Popular Rebellion and Resistance Bloc. And we're really honored to have you here at the Venezuela Solidarity Network webinar. Fran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. for this invitation to talk about what is happening in my country in relation to the arbitrary detention of Venezuelan citizens. We feel that this is an abhorrent situation from the juridical point of view. And with this, I will start my presentation. So, to give a little bit of context to what is happening in the country, it's important, and this was mentioned before by Vanessa, it's important to mention that in El Salvador, we are living under a regime that has no legal or constitutional grounds. We characterize El Salvador as a de facto government. And this is because the constitution itself forbids the president or to be re-elected for a second term consecutively. There is this constitutional prohibition for a second consecutive term of the president. There was even a resolution before 2019 where the judges said that in order to have a second presidency term, there should be two presidential terms in the middle. So the candidate had to wait for 10 years in order to run for a president again. So in our country, constitutionally, re-election is not allowed. However, we have Bukele in his second term, consecutive second term. He initiated his first term in 2019. It ended in 2024. An election completely outside of the rule of law takes place in 2024, where he runs for office again. He wins in a process that is full of irregularities, and on June 1st, he takes office again in 2024, going against the Constitution. So this is a quite complex situation because the people who control state-run institutions are not interested in complying with regulations or the law in this country. This is another important characteristic in our government in El Salvador. And during this period, he obviously took the control of the government's main bodies. In 2021, there were elections, and during this electoral process, he is able to achieve a super majority. He takes control over the legislative body. And one of the first actions carried out by the legislative body is to declare as null the functions of the general attorney and the judges of the Supreme Court of Justice. What happens on May 1st, 2021 is a coup against the legislative body in an illegal way, absolutely against the Constitution. The government appoints judges in the Supreme Court, and these appointed judges on May 1st, 2021, opened the door in a resolution to enable the re-election of a second period. So they change the regulation with the arrival of these new judges in the Supreme Court of Justice in 2021. After this, in 2022, through a campaign, an intimidation campaign about crimes that took place in this context, Bukele, this illegal government, illegal term of Bukele, declares a state or a regime of exception. That, by the way, on March 17th this year, it will be 3 years of this regime of exception. And what this establishes is the restriction of fundamental rights. For example, the right to gather, the assumption of innocence, the right to not have your house violated, meaning that police cannot violate or enter your house without a warrant, but now they can without a warrant if there is an assumption by the police that a person living in a certain house is part of a group of delinquents. They can enter their homes without a warrant. So there are a series of restrictions to fundamental rights now, and citizens cannot do anything about it. So this regime that was approved in 2021 is the second regime of exception that we are living in the context of Bukele governments. The first one was during the pandemic. In the context of the restrictions to mobilization in the pandemic. During the first 5 years of the Bukele government, we have lived under this exception regime, and this year we have continued living under this situation. It is a permanent state of emergency, and this state of emergency has led to a series of very serious human rights violations. Of course, we do not have right to public information. A lot of the information is reserved, governmental information, and so we do not have access to specific data about, for example, the people who have died within prisons in the context of this state of emergency. There have been testimonies of family, of relatives who have received the bodies of their relatives who were incarcerated. So there are some statistics there of people who have been killed within the context of a state of emergency within criminal centers, with signs of torture. Many families have denounced this. There was a movement of victims of the state of emergency. These are relatives, mainly women, who are demanding the liberation of their children, of their husbands, of their loved ones that have been arbitrarily detained in these centers. According to data from the Secretary of Human Rights, apparently there are 107,000 people who have been detained within the context of this state of emergency. Many of them with the violation of their assumption of innocence. So here, the person is not convicted if they prove that they have committed a crime. Rather than this, they are incarcerated only with suspicion, because there is no assumption of innocence. And of course, this goes against the Constitution. In the Article 12 of the Constitution of El Salvador, it says that all people will be presumed to be innocent while they are not proven guilty. And now it's the other way around in El Salvador. And any person who is arrested is already guilty, while innocence has to be proven. That's this principle of presumption of innocence is now the other way around, because many people who have been in prison for 3 years already without having been accused or proved that they have committed any crime, and many people have died in prisons.
So also state-run institutions are not being clear in the face of these abuses committed by the executive branch. For example, the Ombudsperson's Office for Human Rights, which was an institution that was born as part of the peace agreements, which was the result of the negotiation process to democratize the state of El Salvador, is not doing anything, it's not saying anything regarding this sort of situations. For example, this morning, today, we submitted a letter demanding this office to fulfill their obligations. It's necessary for this institution to become defenders, ombudspersons, the ombudsperson to speak up regarding the human rights violations that we have observed this past 3 years. So this is a context, the scenario that we are going through. El Salvador has been promoted or advertised as an administration, as a government that has guaranteed security for its people, even beyond, above fundamental rights. This is the only letter of presentation of the government. What we see is a government going over, trumping over laws. Most laws that have been enforced, even the extension, continuous extension of the state of emergency, is not done according to the legal procedure. Almost all acts that are passed coming from the executive branch are approved, are passed immediately. The established steps in Salvadoran legislation are not complied with. So in this regard, as it was mentioned before here today, Bukele's government presents itself as the government that has solved the problem of crime, and then is offering its services to other countries. Even in one statement, Bukele said that he was in discussions with the American administration in order to apply methods that have been created here in El Salvador, and also to discuss prison aspects. He conveyed a message as of something being cooked up regarding this topic, as we say here in El Salvador, regarding this crime and supposedly being able to solve crime. We believe that the same dynamics is being applied in the United States. Criminalization of poverty in El Salvador. There is a stigmatization. People living in vulnerable situations or in poverty are being labeled as criminals. And this is why they deserve that their fundamental rights are restricted. Because here in 2025, the only budget that has been executed is the budget for the Ministry of Defense and for communication. There is a priority of militarization in the country. This model is also being implemented in the United States as part of a narrative criminalizing and stigmatizing people who are migrants. They are being profiled, labeled. For example, in the case of Venezuelans who have been detained in El Salvador, what we can see is that the government says that all of them belong or are part of a criminal group, which has not been even proved here. So even yesterday in El Salvador, lawyers went to the constitutional chamber to submit habeas corpus requests. There is an illegal restriction of the freedom of these persons. This has been promoted by these lawyers. I imagine that they have sort of a link or connection with the family members back in Venezuela, but we believe that beyond this habeas corpus scheme, we believe that the acts committed by the executive branch are anti-constitutional. They breach the Constitution. This is why we have and we are working on presenting a report on unconstitutionality given the arbitrary detention of people who are imprisoned in the country when the crime has not even proven in El Salvador and they are not Salvadorans that have committed crimes elsewhere either. So this is contrary to the principles of human dignity. How is it possible that people who are kept detained here and their liberty is being restricted when they have not even been tried in El Salvador? So we are working on that lawsuit. Of course, we cover several principles of the Constitution, as we have said. For example, in the Constitution, we see that no person can be deprived of the right to life, freedom, property, or any other right without being previously heard and tried. This is Article 11 of the Constitution. So this is what happened in this case. None of these people have had these principles respected. They are being deprived of their liberty. Also, Article 11 sets forth that, Article 12 of the Constitution reads that people who are charged with a crime will be presumed innocent while they are not proven guilty. So this principle is not being complied with. These people have not been even informed of their rights and the reasons why they have been detained. They have just been transferred to this country and they are in prison here. So we could go on and on about this. There is a series of human violations that are contained in the Constitution and have been breached by this government, by this administration of Bukele. So we want to submit this lawsuit of unconstitutionality. We want this decision to be revoked. The Constitutional Chamber, which should guarantee the Constitution, should declare the decision made by the government inconstitutional. This decision to keep these persons in prison in El Salvador. So people must be sent back to their home country, that is to Venezuela. They must be transferred. And of course, as we have said before, and as people have said this in the United States, they have not committed any crimes. They have not been criminalized there. Now they have to go back home where they can find their loved ones and their identity. So this is what we are going to request. We hope that the Constitutional Chamber follows the text and the legislation to apply this and to declare this act of detention unconstitutional. What we can say here is that there is a crime of human trafficking here because these people are under arrest in El Salvador with an economic benefit for the government. This is what the president has said.
Es importante, Fran. Gracias.
Sí.
Sorry, discúlpame. Sorry to cut you off. But we do have to go to our last speaker, but it's very important what you've had to say. There's so much context that people don't understand and misinformation about the government of El Salvador, the country of El Salvador, that what you are saying about the treatment of El Salvadorians is also, very relevant to what it means for the Bukele government to have signed this $6 million agreement with the Trump administration to deport Venezuelans to Salvadorian prisons. I mean, it's all very much connected and we need that context. So there's a number of, so thank you again. There are a number of links that have been put in the chat by our co-fighters with CISPES for actions you can take in solidarity with the people of El Salvador. So I encourage people to take action and copy those links. And then also, thank you again, Fran, for your time and for bringing us the reality of El Salvador and how that fits into this attack on Venezuelan migrants. For our final speaker today, we have Adrienne Pine. And Adrienne has the job of going last, which can be the most difficult or the most simple, depending on how much the speakers steal about what you were going to say before you speak. But Adrienne Pine is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Social Change at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her research focuses on migration, fascism, and neoliberal imperialism. She's a member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network, of ACERE, the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, and also she is coordinator of the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Palestine. She's also co-leading a Mayday delegation to Cuba for Code Pink, so if you are looking to travel to Cuba, perhaps there are still spaces open. Thank you, Adrienne, for joining today, and Adrienne also has a slideshow, so it might take us a second to sync that up, but welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Let's see, is that showing? All right,
Yeah.
great. So as we've heard from Vanessa and Lucrecia, the renditioning to El Salvador of Venezuelans under the Alien Enemies Act was made easier by one of Trump's executive orders on his inauguration day, in which he designated MS-13 and Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations. By labeling Tren de Aragua in this way, and also by fictitiously designating Nicolás Maduro as its leader, Trump set up the claim that any Venezuelan migrants are likely foreign enemy combatants, part of a violent invasion ordered by Maduro, and thus they are legitimate prisoners of war to be sent wherever he wants. In this short talk, I want to lay out various ongoing processes, all of which have taken place during Democratic and Republican US regimes alike, which have made this instance of extraordinary rendition possible. As Lucrecia made clear in her talk, emigration from Venezuela is a direct result of US imposed unilateral coercive measures. But of course, that's not the story we usually hear. The recent US government and corporate media reframing of Venezuelan migrants as no longer hapless victims of communism, but rather as an invading foreign army, is made possible by labeling them all terrorists. And this gets to the first process I want to emphasize, which is an ideological one. In Latin America, just like in the US, the use of quote unquote anti-terrorist laws and corresponding mano dura or tough fist policies to suppress and criminalize domestic political dissent and the poor in general has a long history, as we heard from Fran in the case of El Salvador, one in which Rudy Giuliani played a significant role, but I won't get into that for now. And one aspect of that process has been the long tradition by the Latin American far right and their US allies of discursively likening their domestic enemies to Palestinians or Islamic terrorists. This has often involved making fictional claims, that Islamic terrorists have infiltrated Latin American countries and gangs, and goes to the Orientalist nature of the terrorist boogeyman, an imperialist and Zionist creation that has become so central to the global imaginary, to the collective imaginary of the global North. So the next process that I want to discuss leading up to this point has to do with many US precedents for this particular case of extraordinary rendition. I won't say much about this slide. Vanessa did a great job of giving us background on the Alien Enemies Act and its horrific uses. We can also point to other ways in which the U.S. has deported stateless people to third countries, has used Guantanamo in ways that increasingly sort of lead us to this as a logical conclusion. It's very similar to extraordinary renditions, where the U.S. in the war on terror, where the U.S. would abduct people from a third country and then send them to another third country for torture. And I call this extraordinary rendition because technically, I think that's what it is, even if it doesn't fit that earlier model that the U.S. used earlier in the war on terror. So the third process that I want to discuss, again, following on Lucrezia's fantastic presentation, is the fact that Washington policy toward Venezuela is one of regime change. And this extraordinary rendition, this example of extraordinary rendition that we're talking about today, needs to be understood as yet another salvo in the US war against the country and its people, so that US corporations can once again gain full access to Venezuela's extraordinary natural resources, as Vanessa mentioned. So while Trump's claim that Maduro has declared war on the United States by sending his invading army of Tren de Aragua villains is a complete fiction used to justify treating Venezuelan migrants as prisoners of war, nonetheless, the bipartisan military and economic war that the U.S. has been carrying out for decades against Venezuela is very real, as we've heard today. The extraordinary rendition of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador is at once a horrific mass human rights violation and simultaneously an attack on Venezuelan sovereignty and Venezuela's right to protect and represent its citizens abroad. So now I want to talk about another process that leads us to the point of this extraordinary rendition. And I'll start by introducing to you some of the key players participating in this apparent act of war from the U.S. Of Trump's act of war by declaring these alien enemies. And the actors are from the U.S., El Salvador, and Venezuela. Here they are. This is Maria Corina Machado of Venezuela, Nayib Bukele, and of course, little Marco Rubio in the bottom corner there. So Nayib Bukele, who mocked the chief U.S. District Judge Boasberg's failed attempt to block what was for him the profitable extraordinary rendition of Venezuelans to his concentration camps by tweeting oopsie, regularly also tweets to his target audience in English. Bukele, who used to call himself the coolest dictator in the world, but now goes by Philosopher King, issued such a tweet on October 8th, 2023, likening Hamas to MS-13 and supporting Israel's genocidal actions, which he has continued to do since then through violent, dehumanizing lies against Palestinians. For her part, Maria Corina Machado, who in 2018 formally issued a request to Netanyahu that he use the Israeli army to militarily intervene in Venezuela, and in 2020, through her political party Vente Venezuela, signed a cooperation agreement with Netanyahu's Likud party. In this tweet from March 17th, just last week, she expresses her support for the extraordinary rendition of her compatriots. So as you might notice here, one of the central features in Latin American fascism, which is of course inseparable from US and Canadian fascism, is strong collaboration with Israel and strong support for the Zionist project, including the ongoing genocide in Palestine. This involves, in Latin America, as in the US, extensive security cooperation, the Israeli training of soldiers, along with local and national police forces in all but a few countries, and those countries that are the exception include Venezuela, of course, and the purchase and deployment by states of a vast array of Israeli weapons and other technologies of repression for use against domestic populations that they label as terrorists. All of this tested, of course, on Palestinians. And while security collaboration with Israel is used in the domestic repression of dissent throughout the Americas, it tends to be most evident in the violent enforcement of migration policy. Sorry, I've lost track of where I am in the slides. So this relationship, which has been emphasized by people writing on migration, Jimmy Johnson, Todd Miller, and others, they call it the Palestine-Mexico border, has been extremely profitable for Israel, both economically and ideologically, in that it strengthens the networks and processes that help to ensure the continuity of Israel's genocidal project by reproducing it in countless different ways and different contexts. It's worth noting that Israel has also engaged in extraordinary rendition by kidnapping Palestinians thousands of miles away to bring them to prisons where they are tortured. And Israel set a precedent for the US extraordinary rendition of Venezuelans to El Salvador by illegally sending large numbers of Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers to Rwanda and Uganda, where they knew they were going to be tortured. Israeli technologies, both technologies for sale as border enforcement tools, as well as in the broader sense of technologies of power, are used in the repression of Venezuelan migrants in the US and in El Salvador. And at the same time, their increased use in instances like this correspond, as Vanessa mentioned, with the other big immigration story happening over recent weeks, that of the kidnapping and illegal detention and deportation of foreign scholars with every legal right to be in this country, who are being theatrically punished for exercising their right to free speech in favor of Palestine. So one thing I think is particularly interesting here is that, and one of the lawyers can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the Alien Enemies Act could be invoked against Palestinians, at least Palestinians not carrying a third country passport, because that would require the US government to recognize a Palestinian state. And all of the necessary focus in recent weeks of activists like us on the horrific and illegal abuses of Venezuelan and Palestinian associated immigrants have been a truly fortuitous distraction for the Israeli government and Israeli corporations supporting and profiting from those abuses, in that it has also taken the focus away from the fact that Israel has been more actively genociding Palestinians during this period than perhaps any other time since September of 2023. So I want to just end with a brief acknowledgement of the importance of the concept of global Israel, which I was introduced to by my colleague Majid Shihad, who demands that we recognize the nature of fascist Zionist processes globally, both for our own accurate analysis and for transforming those analyses into strategy. In his work, Shihad quotes the work of fellow scholar John Collins, who has similarly recognized the solidarity potential of peoples around the world when we recognize that our own liberation is inextricable from the liberation of the Palestinian people. And I will end with that. And I will end sharing too, if I can figure out how to do that.
Yeah, it's a good photo to end on though. Thank you, Adrienne. So that concludes our panel, but I think opens up a lot of important discussions, which perhaps we'll have to continue within the Venezuela Solidarity Network and future webinars when we talk about international solidarity with Palestine and the connection between the U.S. Israeli genocide and U.S. attacks on migrants in Venezuela, and really the role of imperialism worldwide, and how we can't separate any of those struggles from one another. There are so many deep connections, as you've mentioned and opened up for us. I think it's important to just say that Venezuela broke relations with Israel in 2009, and people that may watch these things carefully, for example, maybe watched what's happening in the United Nations, should know that Venezuela is unable, due to the US sanctions, to participate fully in the United Nations and to currently vote in the United Nations. So if you ask yourself, well, where is Venezuela? There's a lot of restrictions on what they can do. And it's important to realize that, if you may be wondering. So what I wanted to say is, I think today we are going to have to kind of ask for closing comments, and within those closing comments, maybe address the one question that we had asked about that was asked during today's webinar on Venezuela versus the Alien Enemies Act. I really want to thank everyone that came today and everyone that helped pull this webinar together from within the Venezuela Solidarity Network, Americas Without Sanctions, and others, because we organized it kind of in quick response to what happened with Trump's attack on Venezuelan migrants. And so we were, not sure the response, but it's been an excellent response, and I think a very important discussion that everyone's brought today. So Lucrecia indicated that she'd be able to answer the question, which was, what is the Tren de Aragua? Is it true they control Venezuela? So I'll ask Lucrecia for closing comments, then Vanessa, then Fran, and then Adrian. So Lucrecia, the floor is yours.
Yes, Allison, thank you very much. Just as a final comment, I think it's very important to continue with this process, denouncing the situation that Venezuelan migrants are living. It's important to have solidarity with the different organizations, like Fran's organization, and like he's doing, where they are struggling for the defense of rights, and denouncing also in the United Nations with the Human Rights Council. It's important that they speak up in relation to this serious violations of human rights that have been taking place. I think it's very important to denounce the different discourses and narratives that we can see in international organizations that have not presented their statements denouncing these situations internationally, particularly when there are things happening in Venezuela at a speed that is amazing. Sometimes they really, and they call out other situations. And now, in relation to one of the questions that was asked via chat, I would like to mention the organization Tren de Aragua. It's a criminal organization that is born in Venezuela about 10 or 15 years ago, within the framework of a criminal organization within a Venezuelan prison. And the government has been carrying out actions to stop and to try the people who are part of this organization. Government has, and this organization has carried out actions not only against people, but also within the people on the outside, but also within the prison itself, a particular prison in the state of Aragua. There was a process of intervention in this prison, and I believe that there has been a magnification of this criminal organization and a political use of this criminal organization, trying to turn it into a transnational organization, when in reality we cannot deny that it is a criminal organization. But I believe that that its importance, or maybe not its importance, but the geographical scope of this organization has been magnified. And I believe that it's important to state different actions that the Venezuelan state has carried out against crime that has been very complex for the Aragua region, because it has been subjecting the population to a series of rights violations. But the state has been confronting this organization through measures and very specific policies to deactivate the criminal organization.
Thank you, Lucrecia. Next, Vanessa, closing comments.
Okay, so following Lucrecia, I like to say that we are all here in solidarity. We are not alone, and we will build that other world that is possible, because it is possible. A world without militarism, a world free of nuclear armaments in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we have treaties about that, but also from the United States, us living here, we have to continue denouncing racism, that is the root of everything, discrimination, colonialism, and we have to humanize our people, our immigrants, our African American brothers and sisters, and many, many others. And there are places that we can go to. We can go to the working group on arbitrary detentions at the UN. It's an independent group. We can go to the special rapporteurs on forced disappearances, because I think there's a case here on forced disappearances. And remember, countries have to undergo through the universal periodic review. And I think I'm not sure about this. I think the United States may be this year. So there can be a lot that can be done, whether it's this year or next. We can do a lot in terms of denouncing the arbitrary policies, repressive policies of the United States. And continuing to do workshops such as this one. I certainly learned a lot by what Lucrecia said. I wasn't sure about where the origins of Tren de Aragua was. Now I know, so it's an education process for us so that we can educate others. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Fran, do you have any closing comments?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you for the space that you have offered here to us to speak about the reality in El Salvador and how policies that are being implemented in the country today are affecting people that are not from this country directly. There is even data about the detention of American citizens in El Salvador, and they are still detained, and there is a legal struggle there on behalf or by their families to liberate them, but they are still incarcerated. From our organization, Bloque de Resistencia y Rebeldía Popular, we believe that the only way to turn the situation around is through strengthening popular organizations, social organizations, showing how this regime, illegal regime that uses the control it has over institutions to subject the Salvadorian population, and it is being implemented in other countries, the so-called Bukele model, as a good thing. And we believe that this should be an alert for all the peoples of the world. In El Salvador, human rights are being constantly violated. People are being arbitrarily arrested. But as Vanessa said, people are also struggling, and they are also organizing. We believe that it is important to continue with this dream, with this need that many of us have of constructing a different world, even if there is a threat of being arrested for thinking about this dream. There are many Salvadorians that are committed to continue with this struggle. So thank you very much. And of course, anytime you want to invite us to speak about the reality of El Salvador, we are there.
Thank you, Fran, very much. So final comments are from Adrian Pine. We got a question kind of last minute, which I think Adrian can weave into her closing comments regarding the U.S. current policy on temporary protected status issues related to Venezuela and the solidarity of understanding of asylum in this context. So perhaps that's something we need to address further later, but initial comments are very welcome, Adrian, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. So I'll get to that in a second. First of all, I just want to mention that, or want to say that through all of these fantastic presentations of my comrades here, what I recognize is the interconnectedness of our struggles, and I want to just emphasize that. And this is one instance where we concretely see them all coming together. That, and of course, all as I was discussing and other panelists discussed as well, how our struggles are also inseparable with the liberation of Palestine. And so I think for those of us in the United States who are maybe terrified at the idea that, you know, fascism is here, although, you know, of course, yeah, I would argue that it's been coming for a long time under Democratic and Republican administrations alike. We really need to be not only standing in solidarity with our comrades in El Salvador, in Venezuela, you know, who are fighting against a neoliberal fascist and just straight up fascist processes, but we need their help. Like, you guys are the ones who have experience with this and who are more directly hit by it, and so it's just a time when we're really going to benefit from this notion of global Palestine, of coming together to fight this. So in terms of TPS, my understanding, and any of the lawyers can correct me here, but my understanding is that TPS for Venezuelans has been canceled, as has just yesterday or the day before the parole program that covered Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti. Meaning that the many people who were covered by those two different programs are now subject to deportation. And so, of course, and what I've seen in asylum courts, because I work as an expert witness for asylum seekers from Honduras, and so I've been in courts, you know, quite a bit since Trump has taken office again this time, is that judges are under tremendous pressure to deny more asylum claims than before even. Immigration attorneys have now been formally attacked by the Trump administration. There was a threat, basically, in another, I don't know if it was an executive order issued a couple days ago, saying that judges who file quote unquote frivolous lawsuits on behalf of asylum seekers can themselves be subject to investigation and, you know, possible disbarment, I understand. So so this has gone beyond just the legal realm. It's you know, it's something that really needs to be addressed in the broader realm of social movement activism, because judges and attorneys are, you know, they're gonna fight this as hard as they can, but the Trump administration has made it clear that they have no regard for judges' decisions, even federal judges' decisions, like the one that prohibited the flight to Venezuela, to El Salvador, carrying the Venezuelans. So my understanding is that it means we really need to ramp things up, because the very weak asylum system that we had, and it was awful under Biden. He made a lot of things from Trump version 1 worse, but it's getting worse now again.
Thank you, Adrienne. And I think going back to what Lucrecia said, I mean, a fundamental understanding as solidarity activists of asylum, or the reason people want to claim asylum in the United States, is because of US attacks on Venezuela, sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, Venezuelan economy being strangled. We have to understand that people are facing very real material conditions of needing to provide for their families and having tremendous difficulty under sanctions. That is their intended consequence. So, needing to come to the United States and seek asylum is not, in contradiction to our belief that and our support for the independence and self-determination of Venezuela and the right of the people of Venezuela to choose their own government and their own social system. So anyways, I really appreciate jumping in on those comments, and
Can
I
I mention
appreciate
one more thing,
yeah,
Allison,
go
on
ahead.
that point?
Yeah, and then we'll wrap up.
Just that asylum has always been a very political issue, even in the federal courts. And so statistically, the countries that are considered to be hostile to the United States, the people from those countries are more likely to get asylum. So the narrative that's promoted from the US government and corporate media that Venezuelans were fleeing this, this dictatorship, this communist dictatorship, has meant over the past couple decades that Venezuelans have been granted asylum in higher numbers than people from like Honduras or countries, where there have been real dictatorships, but they've been friends of the United States. And so this is actually something that's changing now. I mean, Venezuelans, because they're being painted by the Trump administration as terrorists, they're not even benefiting from that false discourse of, fleeing violent communist dictatorship. So that's another important shift in what's happening in Venezuelans in asylum court.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, Adrienne. Thank you again to all of our speakers. I just have a few brief announcements, and while I make those announcements, I'll ask people to get ready to turn on your cameras. If you've been participating in this webinar, you notice you're not able right now to turn on your cameras, but if you are able to and interested in doing so, I'm going to go ahead and promote people as panelists, and we'll do a group photo at the end, which is kind of our tradition at these monthly actions. I know these discussions have opened up many more topics. Every webinar gives us insight into future webinars, what topics we need to address. And yes, there will be a way to rewatch and circulate the panel recording today, both in English and Spanish. It'll be up as soon as possible, but definitely in the next few days. And I believe that we're preparing kind of an email to everyone that registered today that will have all the useful links and the links to the recordings as well. So to close, I wanted to just share a few announcements. The first of which is if you are like to join the Venezuela Solidarity Network, there's a link in the chat. We meet once a month to organize webinars like this and other actions. Really encourage people to get involved. You can message me directly now or join the form through the join form, but we'd be happy to welcome you to our meetings. I also want to announce an event that's happening. It's happening online and also in Minnesota. The Venezuela Solidarity Network member group, Solidarity Committee on the Americas in Minnesota, is screening the documentary Nostalgic for the Future, which VSN also showed a few months ago. There's going to be a question and answer with the director and the filmmaker and Comunera Lana Vielma. Afterwards, it's going to be online and also in person in Minneapolis. So the information, I believe, is on the chat or on the screen. You should be able to see it. And that's tinyurl.com/SCOTA-doc. If you want to register for that, I'll put that in the chat. Also, we received a request to encourage people and to announce to people, there are ongoing actions against the U.S.-Israeli genocide in Palestine and in solidarity with Palestinian solidarity activists under attack. And these are important demonstrations to attend and support. And we wanted to encourage people to also attend with demands related to Trump's attacks on migrants and Venezuelan migrants. And even information about Venezuela, which we could help you compile and put together. So I believe Michelle was going to put a link in the chat about an event happening in Washington, D.C. on April 5th related to this, but likely in your own community, there are upcoming events related to solidarity with Palestine that you can attend and bring information about Venezuela's solidarity with Palestine and the interconnections that we've been talking about today. I'm going to go ahead and start inviting more folks to join us. Give a big thank you to Michelle that's been helping with tech in the background and everyone else in the Venezuela Solidarity Network that helped organize the webinar here today. If you'd like to rejoin as a panelist and are able to turn on your camera, then go ahead and raise your hand and I'll make sure you get an invitation. Big thank you again to our speakers. I think we had an excellent program today from Lucrecia Hernandez, Vanessa Ramos, Fran Omar, and Adrian Pine. And definitely a big thank you to our interpreters who've been working very hard under always difficult conditions to interpret this program into English and Spanish. And that today was Mercedes and Julieta. So a big thank you to Mercedes and Julieta. If anyone hasn't received an invitation yet and is able to join our little group photo now, please raise your hand in Zoom and I will send you an invitation. Also, encourage people to read the last comments in the chat. Again, there will be information sent out to your email if you registered for today's webinar. And also to say that the next Venezuela Solidarity Network webinar will be taking place in April. They are the last Tuesday of every month. So you can go ahead and mark that on your calendars now. Last Tuesday of every month, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, the Venezuela Solidarity Network webinar. That means April 29th will be the next one. It's going to be co-organized with Venezuela Analysis and will focus on the impact of unilateral coercive measures and Trump's attacks within you know, the current context of today and how we can organize against it. So encourage people to mark that down and attend. That is all I have. Wave, put up a fist, hold a sign. Mine's stuck here to the wall. Maybe I'll pull it down quickly. I don't know if you have the ability to unmute. I'll see if I can do it. Ask all to unmute. All right. I know all of you here, so we can say together, Viva Venezuela, hands off Venezuela.
Que viva Venezuela!
All migrants.
Viva la
Thank you all.
revolución bolivariana.
We will win. Yeah, and the words of Vanessa had to leave, but her words, you know, we will win. We will organize. We will fight back.
La lucha sigue, camaradas.
Así es.
Lucha sigue. Chávez vive.